Thanks for all the great work that you're doing. You know, it's now my honor to introduce Dan Parolek, who is going to be presenting on the missing middle housing, thinking big and building small to respond to today's housing crisis. A little background on Dan. Dan is an urban designer and architect, an author, and the founding principal for Optico's Design, which focuses on equitable urban placemaking, innovative housing design and policy, and zoning reform for walkable urbanism. Daniel and his work have been featured in many high-profile publications, including the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Wall Street Journal, and Curbed. Daniel's also championed the missing middle housing movement, launching a website, and wrote the book, Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis, which is now available from Island Press. As a thought leader in zoning reform efforts to remove barriers for walkable urbanism, Daniel co-authored the book, Form-Based Codes, a guide for planners, urban designers, municipalities, and developers, and co-founder of the nonprofit think tank, the Form-Based Code Institute. His innovative work is diverse across public and private sector clients and includes the master plan and building design and architect for Cul-de-sac Tempe, which is a fully entitled and will be the largest carefree community in the country when built in 2021. The country's first missing middle neighborhood in Omaha, Nebraska, Metro, which is redefined Class A multifamily development, a citywide form-based code for Cincinnati, Ohio, and a sustainable growth strategy for Libreville, the capital city of Gabon, Africa. Daniel is a frequent presenter and and recently served as a board member of Transform. He has a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Notre Dame and a master's of urban design from the University of California at Berkeley. Daniel is inspired by international travel, especially in Italy. I think there's a lot of us, Daniel, that are as well, but Italy. The seeds of his passion for walkable urban places started when he grew up in the small town of Columbus, Nebraska. Without further delay, Dan, take it away.
Great, thank you, Mayor Patterson. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me get my screen going here. My name is Dan Parolek. I am the founding principal of Optico's Design. That was a really great introduction. I was asked to come speak with the University Communities Council today, and I'm really excited about it, about a concept that I created in 2011, Missing Middle Housing, for a Smart Growth Network publication. And what's been really fantastic, in particular the last 5 plus or minus years, is that the idea has really spread in its application, not only across the United States, but there's also applications happening internationally, which is just super exciting for me to see. And you know, the seeds for this concept were really planted in my mind nearly 20 years ago when we were working on we were asked to work on a master plan and zoning for the community of Isla Vista, which is in Santa Barbara County, adjacent to UC Santa Barbara. And, you know, a context that many of you are very familiar with, obviously. So, you know, our very first public meeting, you know, we walk in to meet with the advisory group to kick the project off. We were a little bit taken aback by sort of the immediate push and really passionate call for no housing greater than 17 units per acre. And, you know, it really caught us off guard. And we sort of, you know, started wondering in our minds, like, what is it about 17 dwelling units per acre that was like the ideal solution? Nobody could really identify or explain it to us. Why was it 17 and not 17.5 or 16? And what was so bad about 20 units per acre? And so from that point, we decided that it was necessary to make a very diligent effort to shift the conversation away from that scary D word, away from that number, and shift it back to a conversation about form and scale and housing type. And so we took the advisory group to on a walking tour of downtown adjacent neighborhoods in Santa Barbara, and we saw lots of great missing middle housing types. We saw bungalow courts, we saw duplexes, triplexes, mansion apartments. And when we came to this courtyard apartment on that tour, like everybody, this building really resonated with a majority of the group. They're like, we really, really like this building. And they were like, so I stopped and asked them, well, if we can create a plan and a vision and write a set of new zoning standards that can deliver buildings that are similar to this, would you support it? And they're like, well, of course we would. And so I had my team go sort of back and sort of look a little bit more closely at this building, measure the lot size, count the doorbells, count the mailboxes, and just do a little math. And I came back and said, by the way, this building is 54 dwelling units per acre. It's over 3 times the density you felt you were willing to support. And so, and it really took everybody surprised. And from that point on, it shifted our conversation away from that somewhat random density number and focused our conversation on the form and the scale and sort of what really matters in terms of how a building fits into its context. So that was really the seed for this conversation about missing middle. And I'm sort of, as I'm sort of out beating my drum and speaking across the country and working, I think one of my main concepts and sort of asks of cities is like, we just need to stop using the term density. It's a term that comes with a lot of baggage. It's a term that sort of brings negative perceptions into people's heads. And so there's the terms that we use, like missing middle housing and some of the building types directly, are a much more effective way to communicate about the much needed housing choices that all of our cities need. And I always like to start off my presentation talking about why this is such an important discussion. And I shortened this section substantially just because I know you as decision makers and leaders of the cities kind of know the problems, but I wanted to still reinforce some of the main points. And just make the point that a lot of cities don't have the tools to address the housing crisis and the issues that they're having right now. And missing middle housing is just another tool that cities can add to their housing toolbox. So the reality of sort of what we're all seeing in our different cities, whether they're large or small or even rural, is that there's been a perfect storm of conditions over the past 10 to 15 years that are impacting housing today. And it starts with, number one, a growing demand for walkable living. And sort of study after study has shown that 2/3 of millennials and up to 1/3 of baby boomers want walkable living, and that's steadily growing. And those are the two biggest market segments. So, right, high demand and low supply is a pretty easy equation to lack of affordability in those walkable communities. Second of all, we've seen dramatic shift in household demographics. The fact that 1/3 of our households are single person households and that we have a rapidly aging population are impacting the types of housing that we need. And then, right, the growing lack of affordability. In 2017, 1/3 of all households were housing cost burdened, which meant they were spending more than 1/3 of their monthly income on just housing. And sort of that's getting worse and worse as the months go on. And then obviously the rapidly increasing cost for builders, it's materials, it's labor, it's land, it's cost of entitlement. So all those things together have really created a perfect storm of a housing crisis in cities across the countries like the ones you all are leaders within. And so the sad reality is that all of these issues are challenging in most cities, but they're only exacerbated by proximity of having a college or university campus in your city, as you know very, very well. We've actually been working with Iowa City, Iowa, over the course of the last a little over 3 years, I do believe, on a missing middle strategy for how to integrate more missing middle thoughtfully into downtown adjacent neighborhoods, but also in new growth areas. And I do want to mention that most of these efforts that we work on really take a champion to be effective. In this particular instance, the champion was Mayor Throgmorton, and he brought us in. He sort of made this a priority, and this project is sort of near completion. I'll talk a little bit more about it as well. The other thing I just want to mention as a sort of foundation to this conversation is that, and we see this in our work partly because a large portion of what we do is rewrite zoning to remove barriers for a broad range of housing choices, that zoning barriers are a huge issue. And part of this is that zoning in a majority of our cities is an out-of-date operating system. It's a system that's now 100 years old, that's seen very little change. And you can imagine this is a camera from 100 years ago. You can imagine trying to use that camera to, post a Twitter feed, or, make an Instagram post, or even just email a photograph to a friend. And the other aspect of zoning that I don't want to fail to mention that's a really important part of this conversation is just the whole racial justice aspect of it, in that our zoning systems did not provide fair and equal opportunities and access to housing to households of color. And sort of even though the Supreme Court made it illegal to have racist zoning, many cities for decades had foundations to their zoning that sort of led to inequities in colored households. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And right, a lot of those zoning codes delivered really bad infill that sort of built a level of distrust in our communities. I'm sure you probably could point to a few of examples similar to these in your cities in the 1960s and 70s and maybe even early 80s in zoning districts that were multifamily delivered these really unattractive sort of low quality housing choices. So diving into what is missing the middle and why is it important. So many of you may have seen this diagram that we created. I think this really in many ways sort of put the fuel on the fire of the spread of this concept. It's on the left-hand side in white, you have detached single family homes, and we've done a great job of planning for them. We have industries that can deliver them very efficiently. And on the far right-hand side, you have sort of the 4, 5, 6+ story apartments, mixed use buildings, and just in particular over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, most of our zoning codes have started enabling them, and more developers are delivering them. And in particular for student housing, I think what we see a lot of is sort of the yellow flags go up in communities when really large student housing projects sort of come to the table in places where people didn't necessarily expect them. But in the middle, in the yellow, are the full range of missing middle housing types that existed in neighborhoods prior to the 1940s. We have duplexes, we have fourplexes, cottage courts, mansion apartments, and that we really stopped building. It's been decades. The sort of percentage of them, and I'll show you a little bit, has really decreased for a number of different reasons that I'll talk about as well. But if you're going to take one concept away from my presentation today, this is really it, that missing middle housing are house scale buildings. Like, that's a really important concept. I'm going to talk about this, but the definition is missing middle are house scale buildings with multiple units within them within walkable neighborhoods. And so once again, that notion of house scale, really important. This is the image on the right is actually a triplex. It's 3 units within that structure. And what I tell people is if you were driving by or riding your bike by or even walking by, you would never even guess that that wasn't a single family house. And that's one of the real important foundational ideas behind missing middle housing, is that house scale, like this triplex delivers and this is in a large master plan community called Daybreak in the Salt Lake City Metro. Really great examples in that project. Then we have great missing middle examples like this cottage court community built in Greenwich, Rhode Island. And what I like about the cottage court, and this type is really appealing to a lot of different market segments, in particular baby boomers and single person households, is that these cottage court types are extremely compatible in scale with single family homes. Like they could sit on a lot next to a single family home, and it's very compatible, even though the density, it might be 4 to 5 times as much as that single family detached house. And one of my favorite missing middle types is the fourplex. Once again, looks like a house from the street. It just happens to have 2 units on the ground floor and 2 units above. And I'm sure most of you can find great examples of these from the early 1900s into the sort of the mid 1900s in many of your communities. This one is from a walking tour that we did with AARP in the Bishop Arts neighborhood south of downtown Dallas. Now, it's just exciting. I mentioned this earlier that the concept has really spread and become a movement. It's being applied all over Australia, in places like New South Wales, even in Brisbane, and also different parts of Canada, such as Toronto. And we're actually doing work right now with the city of Edmonton to rewrite their zoning to enable missing middle housing more broadly in areas within the city of Edmonton. So why do we call it missing? This graph is from my book and sort of based on some research we did that less than 10% of all housing units produced between 1990 and 2013 were missing middle scale. And you can see in this graph that starting in the early 80s, there was just a steady decline in the percentage of housing that was missing middle. And you might ask, well, why was that? And there's just the list of barriers is unfortunately long. It starts with planning and zoning, but we could talk for 2 hours easily about the many barriers, and I'm hoping some of you will ask some questions. But I did dedicate an entire chapter of my book simply to the barriers, to define them and give some recommendations of things that can be done to remove them. So, and the missing middle is middle in two different ways. And first and foremost, and this is really important, is that these missing middle housing types have a middle form and scale between single family and multifamily, like I showed you in the diagram. And secondarily, these types historically, and if they're built smartly today, can deliver affordability by design, in particular to middle income households. And that varies city to city, but it's usually sort of 60 to 80% of median income and above. And we a lot of times call that attainability. So how missing middle fits into the affordable housing conversation. This is a diagram we created where you have subsidized housing, or capital A affordable, on the left-hand side, which are a really important part of sort of delivering housing to a broader range of households. On the right-hand side, you have efforts to increase supply, so to try to reduce prices. And right in the middle, we have missing middle, sort of delivering sort of that affordability by design for a number of different reasons and characteristics that it has. And it's proven to be able to do that in some of our recent projects with the developers. And so as part of all of our even our zoning projects, we are very thoughtful about analyzing and assessing economic feasibility of these efforts to change the zoning. And this is a great study done by the Brookings Institute called Gentle Density Can Save Our Neighborhoods. It was done about, I think in late 2019, but it showed that, and these numbers might be higher than some of your markets, but just in terms of comparison, like it takes $1 million to buy a single family detached house in this market that they analyzed it in the Washington, DC metro. Now, if a developer builds 3 townhouses or is allowed to build 3 townhouses, they still need to sell each of those townhouses for $1 million to make enough money to justify developing that project. But if the city's policy and their zoning allows up to 6 units, you can see that price point jumps down substantially. Now, I wouldn't call that price point affordable, but it's definitely much more attainable than the $1 million of the original single family house or the townhouses. I wanted to talk then sort of last here about where and how to apply missing middle. And I was really interested in each of your communities. And so I took some time to actually go into Google Maps and look at a large number of the cities that you all are leaders in and the campuses and how they relate to the city fabric. And what I came up with is this idea that the context that the campus is located within should absolutely inform your approach to applying missing middle. It shouldn't be a one size fits all approach. And so one of the types of contexts that sort of I'm going to identify and just talk a little bit about is that in some instances, like Pierce College in Washington, that the colleges are sort of embedded in a fairly sort of auto-oriented or suburban context. And sort of it's a fair distance away from the historic core of the city. And so, right, it just needs a different set of tools to apply missing middle in that instance. And Iowa City is actually a pretty good example of what one city is doing to address and enable missing middle sort of in the growth areas. This was a map of a zoning map of what we're proposing in Iowa City, and this was a growth area targeted by the city's comprehensive plan. And what you can see here is we did some more refined planning, and the dark purple represents areas of this planning area or these neighborhoods, new neighborhoods that where missing middle types are required. The light purple is where you can have a combination of single family detached and missing middle types. And then the pink colors are areas where you can have just solely single family detached. So you see a nice mix and gradation of those types. And in these types of efforts, and even with the infill context, we propose the most effective way, which we feel is regulating form and scale first, making sure the codes are very graphic, very usable, the objectives and intent is very clear, and what we call form-based zoning or form-based coding. And I'll let you ask some questions about that. Another interesting sort of to think about in these contexts is instead of thinking about creating plans that sort of cluster apartments, rather thinking about plans to create neighborhoods. This is the missing middle neighborhood that was mentioned by Mayor Patterson in my bio. This is in Papillion, Nebraska, which is the Omaha, Nebraska metro. And I'll say that this is all multifamily, all rental, a very different sort of shaking up kind of what it means to deliver multifamily and doing it in a neighborhood format. Once again, this project was championed by Mayor Black. The plan and the vision sort of did not meet a lot of the city's requirements. So the mayor really helped navigate this process through the approvals and sort of challenged his staff to think about some new standards that would enable similar projects in the future to be done more easily. So the second type of context is where the universities are really embedded in the sort of historic what we call the walkable urban context. And this is just a zoom in of one of the examples of Ohio University in Athens, where you can see that sort of the historic portion of the campus right here in this quadrant is really right off the main street and adjacent to the downtown fabric. And there's just some different considerations. You can see some of the other examples of folks that I saw sort of signed up for this session. And I'll just apologize. I don't think I got everybody's city on one of these lists, but I did get a fair number in looking at them and hope people will ask questions. I think in terms of applying missing middle to these types of context is that obviously there's going to be locations, especially in downtowns, where you want higher intensity development, and that makes a lot of sense. And what you see in this image to the right is that missing middle housing types make a really great transition in scale from those larger buildings as you transition into neighborhoods that may be primarily single family homes. So they're a nice transition scale and a set of transition types to be thinking about and planning for those specific types of contexts. We're currently working on a plan for Davis, downtown Davis, California, where the University of Davis is, and to enable missing middle in transitions areas at the edges of its downtown. And we can see here is in this particular map on the right, the area in pink is the new zoning map for the form-based code. Is the pink areas are where the areas being allowed to transition into missing middle types, like you see here on the left of the illustration. And then as the colors get darker, it's transitioning more into the heart of the downtown where 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings should be allowed and ground floor commercial would be required. And so we've done similar plans in places like Norman, Oklahoma, studying how the downtown and the downtown neighborhoods meet OU's campus. And I know that we've been part of some conversations with the city of Missoula right now as well, that's thinking about how to utilize some city-owned properties for enabling missing middle housing and even potentially using a land trust to make sure that the for sale affordable housing is permanently affordable. So then there's, right, in particular with larger campuses, there's some campuses that straddle both types of contexts. And this is just a screenshot of Iowa State University in Ames, where the campus touches both the sort of the walkable urban and the suburban. So that just means that there's different approaches and different tools that might need to be considered in applying missing middle to these different types of contexts. I just want to make a brief note here about sort of missing middle housing and single family neighborhoods. And right, we see this happening across the country, both at the city scale and with state legislation. I think Minneapolis is one of the first cities to do this now a little over a year ago, where they eliminated single family zoning citywide. My home city of Berkeley, California, actually just last week, the council unanimously voted to remove single family zoning, but be thoughtful about what range of missing middle housing would be enabled. Right, Oregon, I know several of you are from the state of Oregon. The HB 2001 legislation sort of eliminated single family zoning statewide. And then my home state of Nebraska passed a similar missing middle housing act late last year that sort of does similar actions in terms of trying to deliver a broader range of housing choices. And I think my point the primary point that I want to make is that historically, missing middle types were integrated with single family homes on the same block. And because of that concept of house scale, I feel that if the planning is done very thoughtfully, and if the zoning is done very thoughtfully, that we can enable duplex, triplex, fourplex cottage courts on those lots and in those neighborhoods in a way that won't impact the overall character. A few concluding thoughts and a few takeaways. What can you do as a city leader to help sort of move missing middle conversations forward? I just encourage you all to start now by reframing the conversation about housing. Just like we did in Isla Vista, and we've done in examples across the country, shift that conversation away from those terms like density or multifamily or apartments, even that sort of come with a lot of baggage, and frame it like with housing choice, with missing middle housing, talk specifically about some of these missing middle housing types. And we were effective in that example in Santa Barbara County 20 years ago, that we built support by taking this approach for bigger buildings in the right location, and then missing middle scale buildings in other parts of the community that made more sense as it got closer to single family neighborhoods. I tell city leaders and decision makers like yourself that don't be afraid to take a small step. And that small step could just simply include an introductory missing middle housing presentation, or a presentation in a series of conversations about the need for housing choices in your communities. And that's a very excellent sort of starting point. And many of our clients have done that. And a year and a half, 2 years later, hire us to do some additional planning, or hire a colleague of ours to follow up with that. The next point and sort of takeaway is to make zoning reform an economic development priority. I think what we see is it's really easy for cities to sort of make sort of these zoning changes like not a priority, because this is just another planning effort. It's not something we really need to be doing. It's hard to find the money to do that. But I think what we see is that if you can be thinking about this type of zoning reform and enabling the right type of housing and built environment as an economic development priority, then it's easy for cities a lot of times to make it a higher priority and to find money for it in terms of a real economic impact, having an economic impact. And I think in terms of these zoning changes, this is a diagram we created, a book back to that house scale, is that it's really important to get the details right when you're rewriting that zoning. It's not just the building height, but we say just as important as the building width and the building depth. These all matter to that house scale. Unfortunately, a lot of places are doing it wrong, but this is a really important part of the message. The other thing that we see in a lot of cities, and maybe partly what you're experiencing, is just right there's become, and I'd say like 99% of cities that we work in, there's a culture of negotiation, and it's really because the foundation is a really ineffective zoning code, and so every project needs to be negotiated. And so city council members, like many of yourselves, are in meetings until 1 a.m., 2 a.m., or 3 a.m. consistently, making important decisions and negotiating every project. And I think with thoughtful planning, with the right zoning and right policy, I think we need to shift away from this culture of negotiation, make it easier for the people who are wanting to deliver these housing choices to make it. And then I would say you as city leaders really should demand outside the box thinking. And what we see is that the typical approaches to housing studies, to zoning, to planning, just haven't been effective. And so we need to really think outside the box. I know whether your state might require a housing needs analysis, Conventional market studies we find aren't really that helpful in targeting missing middle. And in states like ours, California, the housing elements, which are a main tool for removing barriers and defining choices, it's not a really effective tool. So we need to really just encourage you to think outside the box and encourage your city, other city leaders and staff to think outside the box as well. And to do that, one of the things we've done over the course of the last few years is created what we call a missing middle scan. We've done this for Greenville, South Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina, Idaho Falls, and are about to get started on a similar effort in San Jose. So if you want to find out more about missing middle, you can go to missingmiddlehousing.com. There's a lot of free information, a lot of photographs, a lot of graphics about the topic here. But if you really want to dive into this, and I think even Mayor Patterson said that he picked up the book. It's available, hopefully it's available at your local bookstore. Try there first. If not, it's available at Island Press or even at Amazon.com. And if you are really interested in learning more immediately, you can put your phone up to this scan code on the right-hand side here, and it'll take you directly to a page where you can sign up to get more information from myself and from my company OptiCoast Design. But I like to end my presentation sort of with a call of action, that no matter with somebody that's listening, they might be just a neighborhood member, they might be an architect, a planner, developer, city leader. I think every single person and their efforts play a role. And I think what's great about this group, right? You're already proving that you're being the champions, and the fact that you're here on a Sunday afternoon, sort of listening to this presentation, means that you're already at the forefront. And I just want to thank you for being the champions. And I hope that maybe missing middle housing can become one of the tools in your in your approaches to help you address the many housing challenges that cities across the country are having. Well, and with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Before we get into any questions, I just want to say thank you, Dan, for this vitally important topic for municipalities. I think in particular, university communities that are often challenged with a large amount of housing stock for the student body, and lacking on other housing options in our communities. I also, let me take a quick scan. Yes, she's still here. Our NLC president, Kathy Manis. I would be remiss not to recognize you, President Manis. Thank you for joining UCC this evening.
Thank you, Mayor.
There are a couple questions in the chat, but now I'm going to go ahead and just open the door for people to jump in with questions that you may have for Dan, because again, I know that we're all in one way or another engaging in this discussion with our city council members, with our community members, our permanent residents, as well as our campus partners. So with that, a couple things in the chat. Let me jump there first. Dan, this came from Council Member Barlow in State College, Pennsylvania. Again, just basically stating that they are lacking with the missing middle from their downtown, and then it becomes single family beyond the downtown area. Mayor Lauren Poe of Gainesville states that there's two main fears. One, the university adjacent neighborhoods, parentheses more affluent, that they are afraid of more students living in their single family home neighborhoods, and two, for historically Black neighborhoods, and they are worried about the displacement and gentrification they are currently conducting conducting an exclusionary and IZ study in the middle, but just wanted to see if you had anything that you would want to speak to on those topics.
Yeah, I'll just start with State College, and it's unfortunately it's not uncommon, right, for university cities where the larger projects kind of showed up in the wrong places pretty early on, and it sort of got community members up in arms. And so I think that whether we're working in Norman, Oklahoma, or Iowa City, or Davis, California. Part of the conversation, and I think most community members really end up supporting this, is there's a need for big buildings, right? We can't just say, there's not a need. There's a need. We just need to do some thoughtful planning to decide where the big buildings should go ideally. And then within that same planning, decide, where should the missing middle scale go? And in some instances, that might be neighborhoods that were historically single family that might need to sort of think about evolution based on the pattern, or it may be, thinking about undeveloped transition areas from the big buildings down into existing neighborhoods is another way. So I think that's, it's an important part of the conversation of like, let's acknowledge that big is necessary. We just need to decide where big makes sense. And in places like Austin, Texas, right, there was a larger area where big buildings were necessary to meet their demand. And so they actually took an entire neighborhood and did an overlay and said, as part of the compromise, we're gonna focus the bigger student housing projects in this one neighborhood, but the caveat there is we're actually going to protect other neighborhoods from those big buildings as part of the strategy. So I think that, if State College doesn't have a history of this, it's probably a good time to be thinking about, well, hey, where does, in other cities that have a similar context, where does it make sense to introduce this missing middle? And that's different in every city. And then in addressing the Gainesville issues, I think, there's definitely, as you're planning for cities like yourselves and this, concern about students, student housing sort of infiltrating into neighborhoods and sort of impacting the quality and character of those neighborhoods. I mean, we definitely have to be extremely thoughtful about that. And, I think I wish I had a silver bullet, that we could bring into every city and say, this is the solution. But the reality is every place we've worked has had an extremely different um, toolbox of solutions to help mitigate sort of the need for student housing and its impact on sort of permanent residents. And that might be, sometimes it's state level legislation that's helpful. Sometimes it's new zoning. Sometimes it's can stop at policy. But I think the best thing to do is just establish relationships with like folks in this group that are sort of trying to confront this and find out what's been successful on their fronts, and share those success stories and sort of where you weren't successful as well. And to the second point of Gainesville, in terms of concerns about displacement and gentrification, absolutely a super important part of the planning process and the conversation. And I'm glad to hear that that's starting at the comprehensive plan level. It absolutely should be. And things that we've done similar work also in South Bend, Indiana, where my alma mater is, in neighborhoods that have historically been households of color. And you can do really creative things about trying to find ways, in addition to new housing, about finding ways to sort of also improve the conditions for existing residents, maybe finding opportunities maybe through a land trust approach where residents of the neighborhood are given first opportunity to either rent or buy into the new housing might be a great way to do that. So one of the case studies in my book, it's not student housing focused, but it's actually a project in the Iberville neighborhood of New Orleans. And it talks a lot about a really tactful and thoughtful way to encourage investment and improvement in a neighborhood, but ensuring that existing residents are sort of benefiting from those that investment and those improvements, not just getting pushed out. And it's a really, really important part of that. I would say that I do encourage at that comprehensive plan level to make sure that you're making specific policy about sort of anti-displacement and racial justice, but also being really thoughtful about how you're going to integrate missing middle housing into the comprehensive plan. You might want to look at, we recently worked on Memphis, the comprehensive plan for Memphis called Memphis 3.0, and it had missing middle housing as a core component of the future land use and sort of community revitalization strategy. So that would be a good plan, and for you to take a good look at as one example.
Great. Again, we're going to open this up, and if you're going to ask our guest speaker any questions, make sure that you identify yourself and where you herald from. I see a hand up from NLC's UCC, the former or past chair, Gloria Betcher. Gloria, you want to take it away? I just introduced you, but take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Dan, I'm Gloria Betcher. I'm a council member from Ames, Iowa. So I was very happy to see that you singled out Ames as one of those places that's not really a suburban environment, and it's not really a walkable environment. It's a little bit of both, but challenges of both as well. One of the problems that Ames has is that we don't have a lot of places for infill. And we are working through our comprehensive plan right now and looking at those future growth areas. But at present, if we were to make the sort of changes that I've been looking at in Iowa City with our code, it could present some interesting tensions between our traditional, what we would call our affordable neighborhoods, and the introduction of infill. So in other words, people buying up small affordable homes to create opportunities for infill, which then destroys some of the cheaper small houses. So it's not unlike the Gainesville scenario, but we aren't necessarily looking at the social justice side in this question. Mm-hmm. Is there a tension between historic preservation and preservation of the current affordable housing stock and infill where there really is no place for infill?
Great question. I'm not surprised that you're grappling with that issue, because wasn't necessarily inherent in I wasn't direct in my comments, but when a campus is in an existing sort of what I call walkable urban context, and you have both, but right at some point the decision has to be made, like what degree of change is necessary or desired for those existing areas, and that's never an easy conversation. But I do want to suggest that you do introduce this idea of degree of change, and map it specifically for every neighborhood. And it's usually like preserve or enhance. Preserve might not be a great term because that's directly tied to historic preservation. Might be enhance, sort of evolve and transform. And just so that as you're going through that process, the neighborhoods and the stakeholders understand that, you know, it's not likely that the city's sort of wholesale saying every place is going to change to the same level. There's going to be targeted areas maybe where there's proximity to the university, proximity to existing infrastructure, existing transit, or just sort of mobility generally, that it makes the most sense for those areas to have the biggest development, right? The most intense development. But there are other areas that may have historic districts or have some other reason that it does make, they have a certain percentage of they're delivering, they're the natural occurring affordable housing, as we call it, that should be preserved. So I think in addition, right, missing middle housing is just one tool in your affordable housing toolbox, right? It's not a silver bullet. And so, right, I don't know in Iowa, I don't remember if I don't think inclusionary affordable is legal, but places where it is, we say, you know, that should be like if a new project gets built that has 200 units, if you can legally say, oh, 10% of that needs to be set aside for affordable, do that. You can think about other sort of affordable, maybe you're creating some incentives that the natural occurring affordable housing stays economically viable and it remains, is protected. And, you know, there's a number of different ways. I'm not an affordable housing expert myself, but we usually have an affordable housing expert as part of our team to help us deal with, okay, here's missing middle, what other pieces do you need to put in place to effectively address this? So I'm not surprised it's a challenge. I know you have, you know, just because your campus is so embedded in a variety of different contexts, it'll be a challenge, but I wish you the best on your comprehensive plan. I think that, framing that conversation is important of like, before Norman, Oklahoma brought us in, they had framed their effort a study to increase density adjacent to campus. And you can imagine, I don't think I know of a single community member who would be fully supportive of just increasing density, like without knowing what that is. And so that framing is really important as a foundation. And you might have noticed, like, our work, well, I didn't show, our work is very visual. So visualizing what those policies and those plan decisions mean on the ground is also really important. Like if you're walking along the street and 10 years from now, what could that street look like? How is it different than what it currently looks like?
So one other small question.
Mhm.
Does your approach to missing middle housing require form-based zoning?
No, not necessarily. We've gone into cities and we've just done really targeted zoning fixes in some instances. Like we've taken the existing zone districts and just said, you need to, decrease the setbacks, decrease the parking requirements, increase the height by half a story. Like we've done those really targeted fixes. If that's what it takes politically and that's what the city has resources for in the short term, we're happy to do that. Sometimes we're just adding a zoning district or maybe two zoning districts to the existing zoning code. And in some cities, they're rewriting, or they have an area where they've defined, and you create a master plan and then a code or is a new set of zoning standards specific to that. And that's where it does make a lot of sense to create something new. So you shouldn't be intimidated by it. I think a lot of it's just a different way of thinking about zoning, whether it's that small fix or, a whole form-based code. It's sort of the same methodology and effectiveness can be achieved.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. I know there's a hand raised. Yep. Jenny, if you'd like to jump in.
Sure. My name's Jenny Breckus. I'm a city council member in Reno, Nevada. And my question is, once you achieve in these university settings of getting product built, whether it's missing middle or higher density, sorry to use the term, in the urban ones, are you seeing trends of who's absorbing those? Is there such a thing as a specific student only projects now that are populated by students, or are you seeing them become more urban neighborhoods with mixed groups and mixed products? And I'll just say, because we've got two pretty high-end ones coming on right now, and the question is who's going to fill what's coming in, and it's just, obviously it's so hard to see what's going on right now because we just can't. The pandemic has a lot of uncertainty. But even 3 years ago, I was in Cleveland on a college tour with my daughter at Case and saw a beautiful condominium 9-story product coming in around their university, and just really wanted to know who was going to be filling that. Would it be for students? Was it the other amenities they have around there? And I'm just wondering what the trends are in college urban settings in when new product comes on.
Well, I think you all can have a good conversation about that as a follow-up too. But there are some projects that are specifically designed and built for student only, and people, developers have a business model to deliver that. And I would imagine a lot of the projects that are coming to your cities are sort of those student housing projects, and they're sort of getting bigger and bigger just because of the need. But then there are sort of like a conventional developer model where they're coming in and doing an urban mixed use building with apartments above it. What we find is it typically varies based on price point of, like, if it's a higher end price point, you're usually going to end up getting like a mix of downsizing baby boomers, millennials who are not students, maybe married graduate students or faculty, sort of like a sort of an upper tier of students who can afford that little bit more, and sort of they'll mix a little bit more. And in one interesting case study is a little fourplex in Norman, Oklahoma. As we went through the planning process, there was a local builder that kept coming in and asking us about the intent, and he ended up buying and renovating a historic fourplex, and he was gonna convert it into a duplex because that's what the market had been driving, larger units. And I said, no, 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 make 4 small units in your fourplex and it'll knock it out of the park. And so he did that. He just renovated it, made each of the small units really, really nice. And so he got sort of graduate students who could sort of afford that little bit more rent in that fourplex, because it costs a little bit more, and he was actually able to make a little bit better return. So I would say it kind of depends on sort of what the business model of the developer is. You could understand that first, and then kind of what the price point and rent is going to be will highly determine if there's going to be a mix of students and just residents of the larger city. I'll say the project we're working on in Tempe, which is a car-free, will be the largest car-free community in the country. It's our client, the developer, is assuming that's going to be a small percentage of students, even though it's only 2 miles from campus, and a majority of just a variety of different household compositions that are non-students.
Great. There is a question in the chat from Mayor Patrick Wojhan from College Park, Maryland. We in College Park are also lacking missing middle housing, and our discussions around affordable housing haven't addressed this at all. But again, looking for some potential way for them to encourage people to stay in the city after they graduate and build their lives here, there in College Park. Do you have any, we don't have any zoning authority, any tips on how they can advocate in their county for better zoning for something such as this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a place like College Park, because of its proximity to both the university and right, the heart of DC, is a perfect candidate for missing middle. I'm sure the prices have skyrocketed in the last 5-10 years. And it sounds like you're under county jurisdiction, from what I'm understanding. I wasn't aware of that, but I think that absolutely should push to get some strong consideration for the integration of missing middle housing into the local planning and zoning. Absolutely. The Isla Vista example that I started off with was Isla Vista is unincorporated. It's within Santa Barbara County. And it was the first project that, first planning project that there was a partnership between the university and the county. And there was also a third partner, was the Parks District. And so they created a formal partnership to make it happen. And that's what it was necessary. So that might be something to sort of think about as well. And that process went fairly smoothly, and was very successful in delivering some great built results.
Mayor, feel free if you have a follow-on question to unmute yourself and ask away if you care to.
This is Denise Taylor Moy from Bridgeport, Connecticut, City Councilwoman. I know that I got on pretty late. I was having some technical troubles. I'm trying to find out in general, when you're doing this here in the urban communities, and what type of effect of having the university communities blend in an urban community setting. You know, I'd have a university in my city that's in the urban community, and the university is fairly well, has been going well, and you know they have student lodging on their campus. But when you're outsourcing and you're going further out into the communities, how is the effect of that with the urban communities, with people that are already living there, the residents that have their homes, that live in that community, that been in that community? How do you build there and everyone remain to have some type of what would I say, some type of stake in the game and where they live?
Yeah, a great question. Thanks for asking. I think that I think the most important thing about that particular sort of case study you just framed is that you want to avoid sort of the knee-jerk reaction of trying to negotiate every project as that comes up, and instead take a step back, build the support to actually do a planning process that engages the community, right? It should be should have a robust public engagement process that engages the residents of the areas that will be impacted, that engages business owners, engages decision makers, the university representatives. And this is a important part of all of our projects. And it's obviously become a little bit harder to do over the last year with COVID, but we figured out how to do it pretty effectively virtually. But a lot of times, like in Norman, Oklahoma, and in Davis, California, we had 4-day design charrettes, design workshops where we set up a design studio in the project area and had our entire design team there and had a structured conversation with all the community members and all the other stakeholders, and put ideas out there and sort of answered their questions and addressed their concerns. And I think it's just really important to have that comprehensive planning and public engagement process to define what kind of development, what scale of development, and where is necessary to sort of meet the need, and what sorts of changes does that require, and understanding what kind of impacts is that going to happen on community members, and are there things that can be done to reduce potential impacts to existing residents. It's absolutely a key part of and it's not easy. Unfortunately, I wish it were a lot easier. And as I mentioned, it's the solution is different in every community, right? There's a different kit of parts that are necessary for an effective solution in every place. But I just encourage, have your city make a commitment to a robust planning process that clearly defines the vision, what the details of what that means, and gets buy-in from local stakeholders.
Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you.
Well, we've got about 3 minutes till the end of this session. I want to point to the chat if everyone wants to look at it really quickly. Peter Exley, president of the American Institute of Architects, and is pleased to partner with NLC. And there's a link there, so I encourage you to click on that link and educate yourselves. So that all said, it's time for us to wrap up our discussion, which has been, I think, very fruitful for all of us and very important. So thank you to everyone who's attending. I hope you enjoyed the presentations today. I'm also glad that all of you could join and learn more about these important issues facing our communities. If you're not already a UCC member, please get in touch with our amazing liaison. I mean that wholeheartedly, Eli Frankel, through the platform to join and receive updates about our upcoming virtual meetings. I hope you guys have a great rest of the virtual conference. There's so much wonderful content, so many truly wonderful presentations, more that you're going to experience from now through the end of the conference. And I look forward to seeing all of you at future UCC meetings. Take care and have a great evening.
Thank you for having me.